I forgot it doesn't have sound yet. Okay, so welcome back. We're going to take a look at the Americas here. So let's just take a real quick look here. Let's go back to the Gulf of Mexico where the Olmecs were previously. In that area, hundreds of years later, we have a culture known as the Aztecs, also known as the Mexica. This is where we get the word Mexican from. They were the original sort of inhabitants of the area of Mexico. And the Aztec Empire was really quite big and successful to the point where it was quite alarming when Europeans encountered it that there was this huge culture there that didn't know anything about them and was very wealthy and very powerful. And eventually, the Spanish conquerors or conquistadors, as they were called, eventually they did manage to overtake the Aztecs, but it wasn't by any means a sure thing because the Aztecs were quite powerful and quite successful. They are descended from the Olmecs, and it's them, because of them, that we know about the name Olmecs at all, and a lot of what we know about Olmecs in general. They called them the people who made rubber, which is where we get the word Olmec, rubber. But the Aztecs were operating on a bigger scale than the Olmecs were. For instance, they had a very complicated government hierarchy that we do have some knowledge of. They were managing all these different cities and basically keeping them all in line from their base of operations, which is around a lake here. And you might notice that this is basically in the same area as Mexico City today. And in building that city, they did some really impressive things. For instance, they were really good at irrigation, moving water around to water crops, but they took it one step further. Basically, they built a city in the middle of the lake. So this was where they had been promised to have their holy land. According to Aztec religion, the gods led them to this special place. And so they decided to build a settlement there, and that became their holy land. And that city was never really destroyed, just sort of gradually converted into what we know as Mexico City today. But they built it onto the lake. And how they did this was what are called chinampas. They built artificial islands in the shallow parts of the lake bed. So they would move a whole bunch of dirt around and build up this dirt and place it down and just very gradually create more land that they could work with. And this is where they grew their crops. And the region is pretty arid, so having water around, fresh water, not like seawater, but fresh water that could water crops, that was extremely useful. So, and they had the space for it in a region which might not have had good land for growing stuff. So it worked out really, really well. And you got to imagine it takes a lot of organization, a lot of sort of management to do all this. So this is an empire that really can move people around. And indeed, they used boats to get around the lake, and they used canals and pathways that could lift up to allow the boats to get through. So they had it pretty well figured out. And their main crop was what we today call corn, also known as maize, a plant that is really good for feeding people because it provides a really good return on investment. And we think that it is folks like the Aztecs, people in this region, who made corn a crop that would actually work for people. In fact, it's to the point where corn can't reproduce on its own these days. It actually explicitly needs people to help it grow. So you can thank these guys for really managing it and breeding it with other with better, hardier versions of the same plants until it became the plant that is so successful today. And let's see, yeah. And in the end, these guys fell to disease as much as they fell to invasion. The diseases that Europeans brought over, like with a lot of Mesoamerican cultures, it sort of devastated their population enough that they were very vulnerable when the Spaniards came in. And so I'm sure we can all appreciate that the diseases would have quite an effect on their lives. So it was quite a lot, and so that ultimately allowed the Spanish to take them over. But a lot of what they left there remained in place. And I've heard that the big church in Mexico City is built where the big temple in their city of Tenochtitlan was back in the day. Now, we do know for sure that they practiced human sacrifice. It's worth thinking about what context they did it. It didn't seem to have been just like butchering their own people most of the time. It was usually enemies that they conquered. And if you think about that, that's definitely a power move to show, you mess with us and you're going to get conquered. And so this was also a big public spectacle, showing a whole bunch of people on top of the steps of a pyramid at the special altar. And so it really seems to be been a way to, show what you were like as a king, that you didn't want anybody to mess with you, and then give it to the gods to give you some sort of justification for what you're doing. But we do know that was part of the culture. Okay, that's our little rundown of the Aztecs. Now let's talk about the Inca. So with the Inca, we're going back to the same rough area as the Norte Chico civilization, which is the western coast of South America. Only these guys spread out quite a lot, roughly in sort of the area of modern Chile in some ways, although not exactly. But this empire, which we know today as the Inca Empire, they called themselves Tawantinsuyu, which means the Empire of the Four Regions. So what they actually were was a supergroup of four kingdoms that all became one giant unit. So it's kind of like the United States of the Inca, you might say. And they were definitely descended from the same Norte Chico culture. They continued to use the quipus for their record-keeping situation. And I believe they did not have writing themselves outside of the quipus. We do know something about the language that they spoke. You can still learn that language today. But there was one particularly successful leader known as Pachacuti, who was actually still alive when the Spaniards came over, who unified them into this one empire. And this empire of the four regions was actually larger than any European empire was in 1438. It may be hard to see when we look at just the map of South America in comparison to going in much more detail when we look at Europe, but in fact, that was true. And again, it was the Spanish who conquered them. In this case, it was in part because the Spanish had a lot of help from a civil war that the Inca were having. There's a succession crisis over who would take the throne. The Spanish backed one party, and so were able to exploit them to get them to fight each other and get what they wanted. But there's a lot of cool things about the Inca Empire. We know a lot about their government system. They had a weird way of doing taxes and work. Basically, work was your tax. This is a system where you owe people work instead of paying money for things. So everybody would owe a certain amount of work to the government, and that is how they planned everything. And when I say planned, it's very much a planned economy. It seems a little bit socialist or even communistic that they were able to, decide, okay, you're going over here, you're doing this, you're doing that. So that's basically how they ran their government. And one of the most famous cities is the site of Machu Picchu, which is up on the mountainside with, as you can see, all these city buildings and all these terraces as well. This seems to have been kind of an outpost with a great sort of agricultural area where they were growing plants and possibly some temples as well. But speaking of growing, they had to use a very specific method. Like the Olmecs, like the Norte Chico civilization, they didn't have a whole lot of room because they were mostly living in the mountains. So again, they used terraces up on the mountains to have flat land where they could grow their crops, which is pretty cool. Here is the picture of Pachacuti as the Spaniards recorded him. You may also know him by another name, which is Cuzco, which was a kind of nickname of his. So it's kind of funny that he ended up a Disney character in the end, or tragic, depending how you want to see that. One more thing I will say about their architecture is that they have an interesting use of stone in some of their architecture, which is called 12-angle stone, and involves fitting these blocks together by cutting them into these sort of irregular but still kind of interconnecting shapes, like trying to make jigsaw puzzles out of them. That was how they built their walls, and it seems to have led to some interesting results, as we can see here at Machu Picchu. We also know a little bit about their religion. We know about their god Viracocha, their creator god. And in fact, the Spanish conquerors recorded a lot of what they learned from the Inca about their mythology and their religion. Now, this may not be entirely accurate, but some of the Spaniards were sympathetic to them, and those are the ones who wrote the most down. But if you look at an image of Viracocha here, you see that it's pretty similar to an image that we saw in back in the Norte Chico civilization. So the gods may be directly connected there. Okay, and one more Mesoamerican or just American civilization I want to mention, and that is the Maya Empire. So the Maya, better to call them the Maya than the Mayans. Mayans is a little bit of a modern phrasing of it. But the Maya, they are backed up more in the area of the Aztecs and the Olmecs, because they too are descendants of the Olmecs. We're talking kind of in more in the southern part of this, whereas the Aztecs are over here. So they had a pretty successful empire too, and theirs lasted a real long time. We see them first getting started in the 200s and lasting all the way into the 1600s, where again the Spanish took them over. And we do know some about their god. There's a great story about their creation myth, the Popol Vuh, which means the book of the people. It talks about these hero twins who seem to appear in a lot of different mythologies in this area. A lot of different ideas of these twins who have some sort of godly powers. And the Maya are, of course, known for their astronomy. And the reason that they made a calendar, which was famous, is because they had the sort of cycle of the year figured out so they could continue it far, far, far into the future. They didn't actually have prophecies or anything like that, though. They just, had the calendar only go so far. They also appear to have practiced human sacrifice for the high status captives. And one of the things that's interesting about them is that they seem to have gone through their own dark age. In the 900s, they go into some kind of decline where the cities are abandoned. We don't know quite what that was, if that was environmental problems, maybe some kind of drought. In any case, they pick up again a little while later, and by the time the Spanish arrive, they are back again to being these wealthy cities, although now they have moved to the coast. And if you look at the art style here, you can see this sort of fluffy and feathery motifs in the art style. So sometimes it's easy to get these three different cultures mixed up. I think you can look at things like their art to tell it apart. The Maya have an emphasis on these sort of feathered headdresses and things like that. They also have their own kind of form of writing. We think this is similar to hieroglyphics in that each of these symbols stands for a particular word rather than a letter. But they have a very nice definitive square style. And we also see again those sort of feathery headdresses and the way everything's kind of flowy in their art. They liked reliefs a lot, which is where you carve into something, but you don't make it a proper statue. It's more like a painting. It's flat. So they use that kind of art style quite a lot. They had their own pyramids. All these cultures enjoy building pyramids. You could even say that ziggurats in Mesopotamia are kind of like pyramids. But their main site is at Chichen Itza, which is a site which was kind of a temple complex and city as well. Again, another important culture in this part of the world. And there's certainly more we could go into. There are cultures in the Americas. There are the cliff dwellers, and there are is kind of in the area of New Mexico. And there are people who build giant mounds in the area of the Mississippi. So there's cultures in North America too. But I've given you guys a lot of information, so I don't want to give you guys we don't have to go through all that, but it's important to recognize the cultures of the Americas that were here before Europeans arrived as well. And the fact that they were growing and evolving in the Middle Ages, just as Europeans were changing and growing during the Middle Ages, I think is always important to bear in mind. So those are our last categories, let's say, Africa and the Americas. And for the three American empires, I would say the most important thing to remember is just some sort of way of telling them apart. what's unique about each empire. For the Aztecs, you've got Tenochtitlan and their unique building in a lake project. For the Inca, you might talk about their 4 empires and their use of quipus and their use of sort of labor taxes. And for the Maya, you might talk about their astronomy or their use of this sort of feathery art style, anything like that. So just ways to tell them apart would be good to remember for the exam. Okay, so that's it for this video. I want to do one more video, which is just kind of summing it all up. So bringing us to the very end of what we're looking at in the course. All right, see you for that.